Hello, today we're out on location and I'm just going to walk through my process for capturing an image. Okay, so pretty typical sunset here. What we're going to do is try and get some movement in the water in the foreground and capture this beautiful sunset at the same time. So first thing we need to do is find a nice location. Okay, so just looking here, if we move out towards the end of these rocks, we want to try and get as much water as we can and not too much foreground. We don't want it to be too messy. So I'm just going to move out towards the end. Okay, so this foreground looks nice. We've got some nice leading lines out towards the sunset and a little bit of motion over the rocks. Okay, so what I've done, I've already focused. I've focused about halfway out into the frame. So that big black rock right in the middle of the centre, that's my focus point. So now all I'm going to do is try and get our exposure to around about half a second to get movement of the water. Okay, also keeping an eye on my shadows. I don't want to clip my shadows. So making sure the histogram isn't all the way to the left. Now I just wait for a wave and click. Okay, and as you can see, there's our first exposure. So there's our foreground. Now I'm going to just wind my dial the other way back. So now I'm going to essentially underexpose, keeping my f11 exactly the same, and then take a shot for our sky. Okay, so they're my two exposures. Okay, so now that we've got our two exposures, I'm going to give them a quick edit and then bring them into Photoshop. Now this isn't going to be a full workflow, simply because what I tend to do is I always sit on my images overnight. So what I'm going to do is just do a quick blend now, get the image looking as nice as I possibly can, and then I'll revisit it the next day with fresh eyes. Okay, so the first thing I always do is work on my foreground, and all we're going to do here is we're going to reduce our highlights. In fact, what we're going to do is, if you watch my previous video on the starting point, that's what I'm going to do. So if you haven't had a look, I've got another video called Starting Point for Landscapes, and that's what I'm going to do. Basically bring down our highlights and our whites and just lift our shadows and our blacks. Okay, then I'm going to just bring down our exposure a little bit, bring it down by about a stop. Okay, so that's looking much better for the foreground. Okay, now the reason I didn't initially underexpose it by one stop is I wanted that half a second exposure. Okay, so when I took the image, it was all about getting that half a second exposure rather than trying to get an evenly exposed image. Okay, so I've purposely done two exposures, one to get basically to have the foreground as bright as I possibly can, to keep all the details in the rocks, where if I had have gone for a more normal exposure, which probably would have been around about here, okay, we would have had, and then if I get rid of our blacks and our shadows, we probably would have had too much dark, would have been underexposed too much. Okay, so I've purposely overexposed to get as much detail as I can in the foreground. Okay, so that's the whole point of doing two exposures. One is to capture as much shadow detail as you possibly can, and the other one is to capture as much highlight detail as you possibly can. Okay, so this one here, now that we've got our starting point, I'm just going to bring our exposure back down just a little bit, probably only half a stop or thereabouts. Okay, so that's looking pretty good for our foreground, and then I'm just going to adjust my white balance. And the way I do that is I just move my slider up and down until I find something I like. Okay, I very rarely use the eyedropper tool. I'd rather just use, especially with landscapes, you know, some images I might want a warm image and some I might want a cool image. Okay, so it just depends on how I feel and what I'm feeling from the image. There is no right and wrong way with white balance. A lot of people like to use the eyedropper, but I find that once you start using the eyedropper, you spend that much time just clicking around trying to find the spot that you like, where it's much easier just move your sliders and work out what you want. Okay, I don't want it too warm, I don't want it too cool. I'm just going to get it somewhere in between, so around about 7,300 looks good. And the same with the tint, just up and down. Okay, too far, just try and find somewhere in between So around about there looks good, around about 20 looks good. So that's my foreground sorted. Okay, pretty happy with that foreground, plenty of detail in the rocks, lots of detail in the water. Might even just add a little bit of texture, and a little bit of clarity, just to really bring out the details in the rocky areas. Okay, bring back a bit of texture in the water. Okay, if it was a long exposure, I would probably go the other way. I'd probably reduce the texture to make it a bit more smoother. But for this one, we want texture in our water. So texture, I would not go over 20. 20 is about as far as I would go. Same with clarity. Once you go too far, you start to get that horrible HDR look. Okay, so just a little bit of texture, a little bit of clarity. Dehaze, I might use a little bit in the sky. We'll have a look when we get to that. And that's about it for the foreground. Okay, so it's a fairly flat at this stage, and that's the way I process it. I start off with a very flat image, and then I'll show you the magic once we take it into Photoshop. Okay, so now our sky's pretty good as it is. Okay, so again, we're just going to use our starting point. So again, if you haven't had a look at that video, check it out. Basically, reduce your highlights and your whites, lift your shadows and your blacks, and it just flattens out the image and brings back detail into the highlight areas, brings back a bit of detail in the shadow areas. That's essentially all I'm doing. Okay, so with this one, our highlights is probably a bit too far, our whites is probably a bit too far, and we're just going to bring up our exposure just a little bit, again, just by half a stop. Okay, so that sky's looking much better now. Now I can adjust my white balance, and again, I don't want it too bright, too glowy. So I'm just going to move it up and down, find that middle ground, round about there looks good, probably about 5,000. Okay, and same with the tint. Okay, we might want a magenta look. I don't. I just want it probably about there, probably about 15. Okay, and again, yeah, add a little bit of glow. We might go up to about 5.5. And again, just have a look at our before and our after. Okay, so not a huge difference, but just a nice subtle difference. Okay, and that's it. That's all I'm going to spend on it for now. I'm going to grab both of our images. So if you just click on one, hold the control button, click on the other one, and then that'll select both images, and then we just press open, and that will open them both in Photoshop. Okay, so from here, what I always do is I always put my brighter exposure on top. Okay, I find that if you follow a process or a workflow, it just makes it easier. Okay, and in my case, I always put my brighter exposure on top. So just with the move tool, we're just going to move our brighter exposure down. We're just going to click and drag on the exposure, move it over the top of the other one, let go, and now that's put our two exposures on top of each other. Okay, now once again, I was with a tripod, so I know that our images are aligned. If you didn't use a tripod, you will need to align your images first. I might do another video on that, on how to align images in the future. Okay, so for now we've got our two exposures, we've got our sky, and we've got our foreground, and all we're going to do is create a layer mask. So bottom right hand corner, the little square with a circle creates a layer mask. And once again, I did another video explaining layer masks, explained it the best way there is. Basically, there is no white reveals and black conceals. It's black blacks out. It is simple as that. So if you haven't had a look at that video, go and check it out. It'll make you rethink layer mask. You'll never think of, you'll never try and remember what reveals and what conceals. Black blacks out. It's that simple. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're just going to grab our gradient filter, or our gradient tool. Just make sure it is on black and white. Okay, and you can just change the colors on here. Bottom of this gradient filter, you can then change your color. So just make sure if it's on red, just change the color and just change it to black. Press OK. Okay, so now that that's on black and white, once we click and drag the gradient filter, it's going to start at black and end at white. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to black out this sky to reveal what's underneath. Okay, so with our layer mask selected, where we start is going to be black and where we end is going to be white. So what we're doing is we're blacking out the top half and leaving the bottom half where it is. And just like that, click and drag, it's now blacked out the top part of that top exposure to reveal what's underneath. Okay, and again, that's why I don't like this white reveals and black conceals, because I've just used a black layer to reveal what's underneath. Okay, and that's it. That is basically how you blend the two images together. So from here, again, what I want to do is get it looking as nice as I possibly can. It's very flat at this stage. So what I'm going to do is just flatten my image. So I've got one, that's my base exposure. Okay, so a very simple, all I've done is adjusted highlights and shadows. But what that's done is created a very flat image. Now I'm going to show you a little magic trick. A magic trick of how to turn a reasonably flat image into a bright, vibrant and very contrasty image. And all we're going to do is click on our background and we're going to press Ctrl and J, and what that's going to do is create an exact copy of what our background is. So now we've got two layers exactly the same. With our top layers selected, we're going to go to our blending mode. Okay, and our blending mode, we're going to change to soft light. And just like that, we've gone from that to that, just by changing our blending mode. So added a heap of contrast, added a heap of color, and then from there, I'd suggest you turn it down. Okay, that's probably a bit too much. So all we're going to do, turn it down to around about 30%. So before and after. So we've added some contrast, we've added some color. We're going to then flatten that image. And that's essentially it. That's basically my starting point. So that gives me an idea of what I'm working with. If you come home with 50 or 60 or even more images, rather than spending half an hour on each image, just do a quick edit as quick as you possibly can, and then go through and pick your favorites. Okay, so once you've blended all your images together, you might have 10 favorites. Okay, and then you can start processing them and taking your time doing more selective adjustments. But this way is a quick and easy. It's not a full workflow. It's just getting your image looking as nice as you possibly can, as quick as you possibly can, without doing too much photoshopping to it. Okay, so hopefully you found that useful. If you did, please leave a like. Plenty more videos coming up. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.